Hi guys, now even if you like EVs and you want one of the biggest criticisms from people that when they're trying to find them anyway is that they're just too expensive compared to their ICE equivalents. Now a few years ago I would have argued against this because there were big dealer discounts, there were various offers going on, and once you factor in the running costs, it actually balanced itself out or even become cheaper to own as it has with me. Now at this stage most people go to the used market, so what is around on the used market at the moment? Because obviously we're talking about cars that were sold several years ago, and back then there were hardly any models. So if you're on a tight budget, you want to spend between £5,000 and £10,000 in the UK on an EV, what is around? Well, I'm going to look online and find out what car I would recommend you to buy at the various price increments between 5 and 10 grand. So let's have a look out there and see what's around. Right, let's start at between 5 and 6 grand. I'll then go up in £1,000 increments, as you can imagine. I'm going to stick with Auto Trader because it's the biggest and easiest site to look on. Now, at the moment, between £5,000 and £6,000, it's pretty slim pickings. This is about the bottom on the budget scale anyway. This is about the lowest you're going to go for a proper EV. But if you are spending between 5 and 6, what is around? Well, at the moment, the two that are on there are two different models of basically the same car. And that is the Peugeot Ion and the Citroen C0. This is the Peugeot Ion, and the one I have found, it is currently 5,250. I reckon you could get a bit off that, but basically it's in the budget we're looking at. Now, it's not the best looking car. It's probably not the best handling car. It's not huge, but sometimes people just want a car to get them to work and back. A lot of people buy these for the winter time instead of cycling or using the motorbike or just literally to go to work and back. It will cost you pennies to run. It's costing you just over 5 grand to buy. There's no battery lease. It can rapid charge, and ultimately in EVs there's nothing to go wrong, and maintenance and all that is extremely low. There's no exhausts, no cam belts, no turbos to go, no gearbox, no clutch, all that. So that's why these are extremely popular. Yes, they were sold in small numbers, which means they're quite rare, but as soon as these appear on the market, they disappear very quickly because people snap them up. One, it's the only EVs in this kind of price bracket, and two, even if there is a bit of battery degradation, you're still going to get 50, 60 miles out of them, and that is enough to get a lot of the public to work and back. It's a good second car, run to the shops and back, a car you're not really that bothered about. There we go, and you know, it doesn't look that bad, does it? Let's face it. The inside isn't exactly a luxurious monster, but it's a car. Some people just want something from A to B, and that is the one I would go for if you were looking in this price bracket. Now, between 6 and 7 grand, it's a lot more interesting. You get a much better car just for that extra £1,000. In fact, it's a car that's still sold today, albeit with the bigger battery. Now, other than this car, there isn't any other choices at this price bracket, but this is the one I would strongly recommend you get between £6,000 and £7,000, and it is the Renault Zoe. As you can see here, there's tons of choices. There are 4 or 5 pages of the stuff, so loads of choice, loads of different colours, different spec, and between 6 and 7 grand, you're bound to get a really good one. You're probably going to be looking in the 2014 sort of age range, but given the fact that you're getting a car for, let's say, £6,500, it's not very old, is it? I mean, let's face it, 4 or 5 year old for a £6,500 car, that's pretty good. In fact, I think it's the same sort of price you pay for the equivalent petrol Fiesta. Now, of course, this is where people will say, well, hang on a minute, 6.5 grand for a 4 or 5 year old EV? That seems too cheap. Well, the reason for that is because they are battery leased. Now, before you switch off, bear with me on this one because it does actually make sense at this age range. I am not a big fan of the battery leasing from new especially, but in older used car terms, it can work to your advantage financially. If this was fully battery owned, because you can buy fully battery owned Zoes, you'd be probably looking at about a 4 grand premium for the same version. So you're getting a car that's 4 grand cheaper, but it has battery lease. Now, that battery lease will probably end up costing you, I'll say 800 quid a year. It's probably a bit less than that in reality, but let's add a bit on just to be on the safe side. 800 quid a year for battery lease. You're saving maybe up to 4 grand on the car itself due to the fact it has a battery lease. So you can see where I'm going here. If you keep that car 1, 2, 3 years, even 4, you're actually better off than you would have been having bought the fully battery-owned vehicle. And of course, what's the one thing, the only thing people worry about in EV terms, and especially on the used market? The battery. Well, this is a battery lease. It doesn't matter what happens to that battery, it will always be covered under warranty. So all of a sudden, age doesn't really mean as much in EVs as it does with ICE, because the motors, well, let's face it, there's hardly any moving parts, they're practically bomb-proof, and they will far outlast the car. So you're getting a 5-year-old car, say, for 6.5 grand, but you're going to have to spend 800 quid a year on it. But the only thing you're going to worry about will be covered. And that includes breakdown as well, so you can probably knock 100 quid a year off for that you don't need. Stick a private reg on that and no one would know. Now, of course, that raises an interesting question: what's going to happen in 5 or 10 years' time? Let's imagine you can get a 15-year-old Zoe for £1,000. I don't know. I don't have no idea what they're going to be. Let's say you get a 15-year-old car for £1,000, but it's got battery lease. It won't really make any difference whether it's 5-year-old or 15. Yes, you're going to have to take care of brakes and things like that, but there's nothing else to go wrong. And if the battery's covered under warranty, then the only thing you've got to worry about is covered. And it won't depreciate. I guarantee, if you bought a 6.5 grand Zoe now, you'll get at least 6 grand for it in a year or 2 years from now. Now we get to the £7,000 to £8,000 price bracket. This gets slightly more complicated because a new model comes into the choice range, if you like, and that is, of course, the Nissan Leaf. The Renault Zoe is still a cracking buy at this price bracket. It just means you get a slightly newer or better spec car than you did in the lower price bracket, but the same thing remains. The battery lease, the reliability, yada yada yada. So what can you get in Leaf terms? Well, you're probably looking at 2011, 2012 Nissan Leaf. Now, at the moment, Nissan Leafs, at this price anyway, are typically battery owned, but you do sneak a few what they call flex cars out there, the leased versions. But most dealers have changed them from battery lease to battery owned, because with Nissan, unlike Renault, you can actually buy a leased car and change it to a fully owned one if you want to. You can buy the full lot. Now, at the moment, at least, all the ones I'm looking at are battery-owned models. So it's £7,500 to £8,000. It's a higher end of this particular price bracket. It's a bigger car than the Zoe. It's a better family car, which is why I chose one. Now, although batteries are lasting far longer than anyone thinks, and this whole thing, you have to replace them after 5 years, is a load of bollocks. But these are the very first Leafs to come out, the 2011, 2012 stuff, the Japanese manufactured ones. And because it was very early, they're the oldest cars, the battery chemistry wasn't quite as good as it is now. There may be some issues with the batteries. They will still work, the car will work perfectly. In fact, it will work in the exact same way it did when it rolled off the production line. The only thing you need to concentrate on is how much range it has left, of course. At this sort of price bracket, you will probably find some that have significant battery degradation. I would just personally walk away from them. You've got to shop around. The one thing that annoys the hell out of me when people choose a car is they don't shop around. They don't spend a few hours online. They don't make lots of phone calls. You're spending thousands and thousands of pounds. Put some effort into finding the right car for you. And who cares if it's at the other end of the country? If it's the right car at the right price, for the sake of a 50 quid train ticket, it's got to be worth it. So between 7 and 8 grand, I would probably stick with the Renault Zoe, because you can do the battery lease version. Or if you can find one, a Nissan Leaf with the battery lease, or a Nissan Leaf fully owned, which is basically going to be dependent on the state of health of the battery. Now, between 8 and 9 grand, you're kind of looking at the same choice as you were at the previous prices, the Zoe or the Leaf. But it does give you a few extra options. For example, there's this Nissan Leaf Tecna, which is the top range model. It's a flex car, so it's battery leased, and that is currently, well, I reckon you get that for £8,500, and this is from a Nissan dealer, so you'll have the 12-month warranty on the rest of the car as well. So for just over 8.5 grand, you're getting a top spec Nissan Leaf. The battery you won't have to worry about, but of course you've got that £700 or £800 a year leasing. So I would class leasing cars as probably a stopgap until the proper EVs come out, the cheaper 200-300 mile range ones come out in the next 2 or 3 years. Or it's the ideal second car, the school run, the commuting car. If you're doing 50-60 miles a day or less, these could be perfect for you if you've got 2 cars in your household. Now, there is one other model in the 8 to 9 grand price bracket, which I've just found 2 of, both 2014, Both cars that I don't particularly like, but in EV terms I'm sure will be very good, and that is the smart Fortwo full electric vehicle. Currently 2 for sale, no battery lease, and the people that own them love them. Again, these go very quickly as soon as they come up for sale, so they hold the value extremely well. They'll cost pennies to run, there's nothing to go wrong on them. The same things apply basically to this as it did to the Peugeot Ion and the Citroen C0. Cracking cars for the price, and because of the very low depreciation, the high demand and the cheap running costs, you keep that car a year or two, it will still probably be worth at least 8 grand when you come to sell it. That is perfect for a second car. Now let's move to the top of our price bracket, £9,000 to £10,000. Of course, there is the usual glut of Nissan Leafs, both leased and non-leased, and of course the Renault Zoes. You're just going to end up getting a much newer version than the cheaper price brackets. Now at this price, I would basically choose between the same ones as it was before, the Zoe, the Leaf, or there is one other example, and this is very rare. I mean, you've got a better chance of seeing a BMW driver indicate than finding one of these. But at the moment, there is one for sale, and that is the Volkswagen E-Up. And no, it's not the same as the Yorkshire thing before anybody mentions that. That's A-Up, not E-Up. This is a 2015, a September reg 2015 car, 50 odd thousand miles, and it's in very good condition for just under £10,000. Now at the moment on the used market, it's extremely strong. Depreciation is almost non-existent, again due to high demand and low supply. You buy a £10,000 Volkswagen E-Up and you will probably get that a year later, maybe even longer than that. Even though it's a year older, you've put the miles on it because people want them. This is what a lot of people don't factor in when they just kind of glance at EVs. It's the total cost of ownership that you need to factor in. What you pay for it is one thing, but what you get for it when you come to sell it is a substantial kind of factor in your equation, in my equations anyway. If you buy a car for 10 grand and sell it 3 years later for 9, that's a bargain. I'm not saying that'll happen with these, but it's a very, very, very good chance it will. You buy a Ford Fiesta for 10 grand, in another 3 years it's probably going to be worth 4-ish. You buy an EV for 10 grand, 3 years later it's probably going to be worth 7. Again, mainly due to the fact that it is supply and demand. And if it's a leased EV, the battery, well, who cares? It doesn't matter. It's covered under warranty. The biggest criticism of EVs is the battery. So there we go. Let's recap. Not a huge choice because only 2 or 3 manufacturers were manufacturing EVs back then. But ultimately, if you're looking at between 5 and 6 grand, I would go for the Peugeot Ion or the Citroen C0. If you're really lucky, you might find a lease battery Zoe in that price bracket, but not quite yet. For between £6,000 and £7,000, I would go for a Renault Zoe with battery lease. Hands down, the best value car you're going to find on the used market at the moment. And if you're worried about batteries, you don't have to, because the battery is leased, of course. How long you keep the car will determine whether or not it is good value for you. For between 7 and 8 grand, the Nissan Leaf sneaks into it with both flex or battery lease versions and battery owned. So if you need a bigger, more of a family car, then I would probably go for either the Zoe or the Leaf. Both are cracking cars, both very, very cheap to run and relatively available on the used market. Now between 8 and 9 grand, I would probably recommend either going for a slightly newer or better spec Zoe or the Nissan Leaf, either in the battery owned or the battery Leaf version. That is up to you entirely. Between 9 and 10 grand, it's kind of the same choice. It's kind of getting, a bit repetitive is this, I admit, but ultimately a much newer Zoe, a much newer higher spec flex Leaf, or of course something like the Volkswagen E-Up if you want something a little different and a lot rarer. So there we go, that's your choice. Pretty much it's either Zoe or Leaf for the most part. I could have probably done this video in about 30 seconds, but you get the point. And if you are looking for a used EV, or if you have bought a used EV in this price bracket, please let me know what it's been like for you. Let people know what it's been like to own a car that was 4 or 5 years old, which everyone tells me is when batteries need replacing. And have you had any issues? Have you had any troubles? Have you ever had to claim under warranty for a leased Zoe or a leased Leaf? I still have yet to speak to someone who has had to claim under warranty for any of their batteries. I cannot find anyone that's done this because batteries are lasting far, far longer than anyone seems to think. Far longer than even the manufacturers did. Now, of course, there were issues with the extremely early versions, the 2011, 2012 cars. That's to be expected with such a new technology, but ultimately you will see that reflected in the price. So would you do the battery lease? Now I've kind of explained it in this way. You have a £10,000 budget, why not keep £3,000 of that and then set it aside for the lease? So there we go. If you've got a budget of between £5,000 and £10,000 and you absolutely, for whatever reason, want an EV, they're your options. Of course, things will change over time, things will come up, but at the moment, with the extremely buoyant used prices for EVs, it's probably going to be at this price for, I reckon, for the next 1 to 2 years minimum, just because, again, supply is outstripping demand. So please click the subscribe button below, ask me any questions, let's generate some comments, and I'll see you soon. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.